Do you think Britain is heading for declaring bankruptcy and going to IMF to be bailed out?
Possibly. You're just taking out more credit cards to pay off the interest on the original debt. Debt interest spending is starting to go through the roof. It's well over 100 billion now. It's our fourth highest item of government spending. We're not particularly fit for a much more uncertain world. What you really need is sustained 3% growth, and we're nowhere near that. We're celebrating if we get over 1% at the moment.
How much would we even need to tax people just to stay afloat?
If you increase income tax by 1 percentage point, that would raise revenues by about 6 billion. If you're talking about fiscal black holes of the tens of billions, that shows you the kind of thing that you need to do just to the basic rate of income tax to just repair the black hole. Controlling spending is the most important thing. Only then can you really start to think about tax reform.
My guest is John O'Connell, the CEO of TaxPayers Alliance, the group that's been auditing Britain's bills for 20 years. This is an overdue bill that nobody in Westminster wants you to know about.
We're maxed out. We're tapped out, and there is no magic source of revenue that hasn't yet been taxed that doesn't have a disastrous economic effect.
I want to play like a rapid fire game of Snog, marry and avoid, but with our current taxes.
Okay.
So the taxes that we currently have, where, marry would be perfect as is, Snog would be sort of the fiscal doer-upper, and then avoid is abolish it completely. Are you ready?
Oh, all right. Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so income tax.
Snog.
National insurance contributions.
Avoid.
Ooh. VAT.
As currently constructed, Snog, but basically marry.
Okay. Corporation tax.
Avoid.
Capital gains tax.
Put that in the Snog.
Inheritance tax.
Avoid.
All the socialists and communists across the country are gasping right now. Stamp duties.
Avoid. For sure.
Council tax.
Snog.
Business rates.
Snog.
Fuel duty.
Snog again.
Tobacco, alcohol duties.
Snog.
Air passenger vehicle excise duty, these type of things.
Snog as well.
And last one that we will do is environmental taxes.
Snog, because we need to acknowledge the cost of externalities.
You know what? If you said avoid there, I would be like, oh my God, that's Greens out of the picture as well. Okay, well, the good news was I've really enjoyed this little game. The bad news is we have one tax that you class as marry. So out of all of the taxes that we have in the UK, you think that only one of them has got a potential for marry.
Yeah, a lot of it is to do with how they're constructed, right? So VAT, economically speaking, taxing consumption is better than taxing work, labor, income. However, VAT, as it's currently constructed, is full of exemptions, zero rates, and this kind of thing, such that it means that the headline rate for everybody is quite high. It's at 20%. So if we had a system a bit more like that in New Zealand, where it was broad-based, close to no exemptions, you could have a much lower headline rate. You could run the numbers 10, 15%, but it certainly wouldn't be 20 because there wouldn't be any of these exemptions. The politics of that are, of course, really, really difficult because of the things that are zero rated and are exempt are things like children's clothing, baby food, I think. So you find a politician who wants to put a tax on children's clothing and baby food, I think you'd be very hard pressed. But it's sort of symptomatic of how we do taxes in Britain, which is lots of complications, lots of fiddles, lots of using the tax system as a political instrument to give favors to particular causes or particular interests, instead of having broad base and low rates and a simple tax code, which is
Hmm.
obviously more preferable. The tax system ought not to discriminate against somebody or a business based on how they earn their income or what business they engage in. As long as it's legal, then the tax system ought to be neutral in that regard. So, that should apply to consumption taxes too, from a purely economic perspective, but appreciate it's quite difficult. That's why, I'd say married to VAT. But certainly, when you look at some of the other taxes you mentioned, Kat, with environmental levies, fuel duty, things like that, it's probably economically correct. I think it's a bad phrase, but economically justifiable, should we say, to
Hmm.
acknowledge the cost of externalities. So some sort of charge or tax, might be necessary from an economic perspective. But again, how these things are constructed, the rates that are applied, very complicated, very burdensome, and also, you go back to income tax. Over the years, I think I gave that a snog because, again, it's not broad base and low rates. It's very much the personal allowance has gone up so much over a number of given years, which is good news for those on lower incomes.
Hmm.
But at the same time, it narrows out the tax base. It really thins out the tax base. So you're relying on a narrower set of people to actually pay taxes. So what does that mean? Then politicians think, oh, what are we going to do? We're going to have to hold the 40% rate where it is. And then as earnings increase, we're going to capture more people into the 40% rate because we've taken so many people out at the bottom end. We're going to have to capture people on, middle incomes, really. So
Hmm.
about nurses, teachers, these kinds of things, these kinds of professions that are being dragged into 40% rates. So that's why I was pretty much giving the sort of middle of the road snog across the board, because taxes are fine in at reasonable rates, at non-punitive rates to fund essential public services. But the way that they're constructed in Britain is suboptimal, shall we say. We've got a tax code that's somewhere around 25,000 pages, one of the most complicated in the world, and it causes lots of economic distortions.
Yeah. And I think one thing as well that perhaps people don't often appreciate is, because we've had such a persistent inflation now for a number of years, the people that are just approaching that 40% threshold, the the pay rises that you then get essentially just drag you into the higher taxation rate, but you haven't actually earned more in terms of the real spending money.
No, and this is why people feel like they're not moving on. You could get a pay rise at work, but it doesn't really do all that much to your bottom line. And with inflation, things are more expensive in the shop, so you're sort of doubly feeling the pinch with a higher rate of tax, and then
Hmm.
inflation on the things that you need to buy. So it's hardly surprising that people feel worse off than they were just a few years ago. The talk of a cost of living crisis, etc., etc. Real incomes haven't actually moved all that much since 2008, which is approaching 20 years now. So
Hmm.
it's little wonder that people are, feeling the pinch, exasperated with the system. And, I talked about the cost of living crisis. I would actually go back one step and say that we've got a cost of government crisis, in the sense that, okay, why are things expensive? High taxes. Okay, so Rachel Reeves puts up employers' national insurance. In the media, that's discussed as a tax on business. Businesses can pay, it's fine. But a business can't pay taxes. It's a filing at Companies House. It is not a tangible thing that can pay a tax in the same way that your TV doesn't pay the TV license, your toaster doesn't pay the electricity bill. People pay taxes, and so when taxes go up on businesses, that uh, you know all the academic evidence as well as common sense tells you that means that Employees receive lower wages than they otherwise would have. So they might get a pay rise, but it could have been higher if employers' NI didn't go up, or they get pay freezes, or jobs are cut,
Mm-hmm.
or there's higher prices. The taxes that are put on by politicians are then passed on in higher prices in the shop, or there's lower returns to capital. So that impacts investment, which it creates growth and jobs, and businesses need to thrive.
Mm-hmm.
So that cost of government crisis is actually causing a lot of the cost of living crisis. So when the politicians talk about how we're going to solve the cost of living crisis, and they want to come up with these little sticking plaster solutions, and subsidies here and handouts there, they're actually causing the problem in the first place through overregulation and high taxes.
I mean, this is something that I actually wanted to try and understand. I don't mix, with the government officials and politicians, so it's very difficult for me to gauge whether they are blatantly lying, or to on their interviews, or whether they are just completely unaware that when they are saying that they are growing the economy but doing or implementing policies that are directly damaging economy, do they believe that they are doing good, or are they just hoping that the public isn't going to be outraged by their lies because the public either isn't as switched on, or maybe they just don't quite understand the levers of
Yeah.
taxation systems?
It's hard because both answers are disturbing. If they're lying, then that's disturbing. But if they don't understand what they're doing, that's also disturbing. I do get the sense that most politicians I've ever encountered, I wouldn't say all, but most, have reasonably good intentions. They might come from a different ideological perspective from me, but to a large degree, they come into it thinking that they're going to change the country. Where I think that they fall down, several ways. Several ways. If you look at the current cabinet, I don't think that there's a member of the current cabinet that has a successful business career behind his or herself. So they've come into the cabinet either as lawyers, typically, or working for trade unions or activists, or a very political background. And this means two things: that they don't really understand what it takes to make a business grow and thrive, and the sweat of paying payroll with your own money just to make it through to the end of the month, that grind that entrepreneurs have to go through in order to get things off the ground. And then secondly, I think that they sort of therefore, because they don't understand that, they therefore overstate their own influence on the broader economy. I think that the smartest politicians realize that they set frameworks and parameters, and that the good people of Britain go out and do the rest. They start
Mm-hmm.
businesses, they innovate, they satisfy market demands that politicians could never conceive of, being needed. But that's not politicians' job. A politician's job isn't to sort of decide, okay, well, the market ought to be producing X, so let's produce X. And that's not their job. Their job is to set frameworks, guidelines. And then there's this sort of self-perpetuating media cycle, of course, where economic news becomes political news. So what happens is, there was an announcement this morning on GDP, a monthly GDP number, or I think it was 0%. So the economy flatlined for the month. That's not particularly helpful. Knowing GDP figures every single month doesn't really tell us much. You need to sort of zoom out big picture on that. And we all know the big picture isn't great. But B, it becomes immediately part of the political chatter. What does it mean for the chancellor? Is she up or is she down in top of the pops kind of charts? It's without thinking about what's actually happening to our construction sector. What's happening underneath the numbers, what's happening with services, what's happening with public services, what's happening with public service productivity. There's no analysis of the numbers beneath that, because it becomes part of this political circus, and that narrative is sort of self-reinforcing. Because you've got people in the cabinet who aren't business people, they then perform the dance for the media because the media requires it of them, because everything is inherently political. So it's a quite negative, self-reinforcing circle that we do need to
Mm-hmm.
break. We do need proper analysis of what's going on in order to help correct it. But politicians ought to know their limitations, but also, within those limitations is genuine, power to drive and shape what the country looks like. So therefore, they need good guiding visions, good principles, and good understanding of how an economy ticks over. Um, so yeah, good intent. To go back to your original questions, good intentions for the large part, but I just think between that, and then of course, who do they take advice from? Civil servants, treasury civil servants are, you have to say this, brilliant minds and some of the best minds in the country. I'm sure that's true, but again, where's the business experience? An Oxbridge economics degree is wonderful. Don't get me wrong. I would never denigrate a proper education, but it doesn't mean that you've had a good business career. And again, in the treasury itself, it leads to this notion of looking at things in a very static sense. We need money for next year's spending, so we just need to tweak the tax levers a little bit to bring in some money, without realizing the dynamic impacts of that kind of decision making. So, if you do increase inheritance tax on family-owned businesses, how does that change their incentive structure? What does it mean for what they're going to do for year 5 and year 10? And what does it mean for growth, jobs, investment, productivity?
Mm-hmm.
These are the kinds of questions they don't really understand. They understand the steps they need to take to fill next year's coffers, but not really what it means more dynamically for the economy.
I think what you said there, that that the politicians in power are relying on public service. You would think that there is a slight conflict of interest there, because we've got a hugely inflated public service that is unproductive. They don't create anything, they just draw from the economy. What are they now? Something like 50% of the government spending. It's something ridiculous. Last time when I looked at it, it was, I think, approaching 50%. And you think, well, that's completely unproductive blob where we are pumping more and more money into them, and we are taking advice from the people that are within the blob about what we should do to grow the economy.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, you've hit on something.
it's a little bit of like, turkeys for Christmas
Yeah, yeah,
type
you've, you've,
of.
you've hit on something really important, and the growth in the public sector headcount has increased since the pandemic. Now, in the pandemic, they hired lots of people in order to deal with what was then seen as, we can argue the sort of the details of that in a different session, maybe, but at the time, it was seen as a national emergency. So they hired a bunch of people to deal with a national emergency. That national emergency has now finished, and yet we have a bigger public sector headcount than we did then. It's
Mhm.
the same with after the Brexit vote. They felt that they needed to hire lots of people in order to deal with the regulatory changes and all of this kind of stuff. But again, we've got a higher public sector headcount now than we did then. Why
But it
is that?
doesn't work. You can't get hold of them ever.
No, no, no. And anybody on the line to HMRC will know that it's goodness, a pain to put it mildly. So yeah, and public sector productivity, particularly, has flatlined. So it's not getting more productive. They keep hiring more people, which makes it even more unproductive in many ways. So lots of people say, right, okay, well, what we actually need to do is pay people more money, such that we get a higher caliber of individual. And I'm not necessarily against that. However, I think within the current incentive framework that exists in the public sector, I think it would just be a continuation of the same, but just with higher salary bills. So, to boil that down, what I'd like to see is a smaller, much more dynamic public sector with looser employment rules, not so union driven, so that you can get rid of people when they're not performing, which is
Hmm.
possible now. At present, this is not a joke. Quite a lot of the time, people are moved out of teams, but moved upwards. Then when they're not performing well, they're so desperate to get them out of the team, they'll promote them out. So that happens quite a bit in the public sector. So what I'd like to see is smaller, more dynamic teams with, um, you know, basically private sector employment laws. If you're not doing the job, then bye bye. So if we had that framework, then higher salaries would be completely acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
But then you see it now at present. I forget the exact figures, but it's somewhere around this. But there was a head of cybersecurity role that was advertised, and I can't remember if it was for the Home Office or the MOD. But either way, head of cybersecurity for one of those two departments. Pretty important job, and I think it was pitched at around 55 or 60,000 pounds a year. And
Yeah, I remember
when
that.
you are talking about that versus the head of equality, diversity, inclusion at a particular NHS trust who would be on, say, 120,
120 grand.
130 grand a year, the priorities are so skewed that I would be hesitant just to chuck more money at every single role in the public sector to attract more better people. I want to see a much deeper change in the incentive framework, and then you can start to bring people in. Again, parking what one thinks of COVID and the pandemic and a pandemic response. When this was actually tried in real life, the vaccine task force, they were stripped of all the rules and bureaucracy that applied to normal public sector roles for procurement and HR and all sorts of other things.
Mm-hmm.
They were told just get on with it, just get it done, and they got it done at quite impressive speed. So it is possible, but there's a whole bunch of rules that would need to be stripped back. Union power needs to be stripped back. And then we could see a smaller, more dynamic, more productive public service that actually delivers services of a level that matches the sky-high tax burden that we currently have.
Yeah. I just want to sort of zoom out from the taxes just for a moment, and I'm sure we'll come back to them. But in literally the last sort of 6 to 8 weeks, we now have got quite prominent economists that are warning of the sort of 1976 style IMF bailout if we don't change the fiscal decision making in the country. So what I'm trying to understand is European economies do have high public debts, but our debt is particularly high. We are an outlier when we compare us against the European countries. And I believe that part of it is because the interest rate that we pay on the public debt, the bigger percentage of it is linked to inflation. It's actually like indexed for the inflation.
Yep.
Now, from the investor's point of view, and the big mutual funds and things like that, like that's a great deal. But what's the trade-off for the government to have that? Because currently it doesn't seem to be working particularly well.
No, nice bit of understatement in your closing there. Doesn't seem to be protected. So index-linked stocks, gilt stocks, currently ours is about 24.5% of the debt is index-linked. Just looking at the figures now, Italy's is the next one down. In the G7 is Italy at 11.7, and it goes all the way down to Japan at 1%. The reason that we have so many goes back to the 1970s, when UK was sort of unique in having fairly persistent double-digit inflation, and it made us quite a poor, prospect for investors. So trying to raise money on the capital markets was probably, well, it wasn't probably, it was definitely difficult. So what the Geoffrey Howe as Chancellor did in 1981 was introduce these index-linked instruments. What that was intended to do was to deliver confidence to investors that their investment was safe in the UK, and that that kind of worked over time. When we did, we were able to get inflation under control and all of this kind of stuff, and it kind of worked over time to the extent that actually it was calculated that over the course of, I think it was from 1981 to 2023, the government actually saved money as a result of this measure by about 100 and something billion. The second reason was because the pension funds at the time had lots of index-linked liabilities through defined benefit pensions, which are sort of very generous final salary schemes that used to exist in the private sector when
Mm-hmm.
life expectancy was lower, and this kind of thing. So there were lots of index-linked liabilities. So the government was sending a confidence message to pension funds as well, and it worked. Britain did become a bit of a safe haven for investment and these kinds of things. However, we're not in that world anymore, and those chickens are very much coming home to roost. And we're now starting to see that our debt interest spending is starting to go through the roof. I
It's
think
enormous.
it's well over 100 billion now. It's our fourth highest item of government spending, and it's forecast to be 132 billion, I believe, by 2030. We also live in a much more uncertain world, so inflation shocks, and we've got sort of inflation slightly more bedded into our economy than others at the moment. And we don't produce much of our own energy anymore, for instance. We're reliant on global energy markets, and when there's global external shocks, we're sort of at the whim of global energy markets. Supply chains are much less certain than they used to be, for instance. That can help drive up inflation. So we're sort of in a position that's not particularly fit for a much more uncertain world that we seem to be heading into. I think everybody can
Mm-hmm.
see that. But that's the reason that we have such high index-linked gilt stocks. So it was originally a good idea until it was a bad idea.
I mean, yeah, it's been like 50 years now. So why did the government not like renegotiate the terms once the UK sort of stopped being this, investment sort of playground, if you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah,
Because
yeah.
you would think that before this sort of the quantitative easing and all of the sort of essentially printing money that we did in the last 5 years, someone would have think, hold on a minute. Like,
Yeah,
was there
yeah.
just not enough time, or like, why did they not renegotiate it like in early 2000s?
Yeah, in fact, the opposite happened. Gordon Brown and George Osborne, as chancellors, both put the foot on the accelerator with these instruments, actually. And it wasn't until Philip Hammond was chancellor, and in around 2018, they were looking at this, and they basically started to cut back on it. By that time, is it too late? Obviously, it kind of is, but there was an acceptance at government level that this actually this wasn't a good longer term bet, even or even longer term than the early 1980s. So there was an acceptance in government that it wasn't going quite in the direction we hoped. Even in the mid 2000s, or was it in the 2010s? The House of Lords Economic Affairs Committee issued a report, sort of sounding the alarm on this, but times were good. Inflation was low, interest rates were 0.1%, etc., etc. So it's much easier to stick your fingers in your ears and just look at people who focus on the basics: money costs money, etc., etc. And just,
Mm-hmm.
well, you guys are cranks. The world's changed now, and there's low interest rates, and we've worked out how to navigate global markets in these ways until it all comes crashing down like it has now, and debt interest costs are just going through the roof, and will only continue to go one way,
So
unfortunately.
for the people that are maybe not plugged in as much, can you just, the way that I understand it in a terms that I would explain to a child is that like right now we are paying our interest by taking more credit cards to pay that interest. We're not actually paying the debt. We are just increasing the debt just to stay afloat with the interest rates. So can you just sort of paint the picture for the public that maybe are not like, plugged into the worlds of guilds and things like that?
I think you've just described it reasonably well. I think households themselves get into like there's all sorts of huge differences, but for the sake of simplicity, it is the same as a household finding themselves in so much debt that they're borrowing to pay for the debt and never really touching the actual debt itself. All they're really doing is paying off the interest. And it's a position we're finding ourselves in. And not only that, we've narrowed the tax base, so we can't, through an emergency situation, say, put up, income tax, and double on top of that. Rachel Reeves, well, the Labour Party in general, promised in their manifesto that they wouldn't touch income tax, national insurance, and VAT. So that kind of rules out the big three tax raising powers. So that is why. So, if you think about a household, their revenue coming in and, it's staying still, but the costs of the debt keep going up and up and up. That's the situation we're finding ourselves in now. So yeah, you described it pretty well. You're just taking out more credit cards to pay off the interest on the original debt and not even getting the principal cost down.
That is completely unsustainable.
Yeah, of course it is. And there's one way that politicians see us getting out of this, and that's growth, right? So that's why the current government talk about growth so much, because if we think about debt as a percent of our overall economy, it's now over 100% of GDP. So that means that the debt that we have, the stock of the debt that we have, is about the same size of what the whole economy produces in a single year. But if we, grow that economy, then the debt as a proportion of that economy becomes smaller by definition. So that is what politicians want. They don't necessarily worried about paying off the principal. They just want to grow the economy so much that it becomes much less of a problem. However, all of the things that they're doing are not helping growth whatsoever. So actually, the way that politicians really want to get out of it is economic growth. But what you really need is sustained growth of 2% minimum, probably 3% per annum, every single year, 3% growth, and we're nowhere near that. We're celebrating if we get over 1% at the moment. So it's kind of worrying times, to put it mildly.
Do you think Britain is heading for declaring bankruptcy, essentially, and going to IMF to be bailed out?
Possibly, but the main difference is, without getting too into the weeds about it, is back in the 1970s. We held a lot more foreign currency reserves. We're sort of much more in control of things in that way. The second thing is, does the IMF have the money? I mean, they're going to have to go to member nations to do it. And, there's other countries like France that are probably in a similar situation to us, if not worse, who are maybe having similar conversations. So is there the money to do it? Probably not. But, at the end of the day, we do have the ultimate power to continue to print more money. I mean, that is not a good idea. Don't get me wrong. I'm not advocating it, but we do have that power at the end of the day. So
why not? Because I've recently came across a video of a professor in university that was essentially saying that we can print money forever.
But then, that money costs money. And, if you have too much of it in the economy, then you'll see inflation take off. And given that we have such a big proportion of our debt linked to inflation now, as we've discussed, that could be a bit of a problem. If you create too much money, you cause inflation. I think, over the past few years, past couple of decades, really, when we've had low interest rates, low inflation, I think academics and economists and, or some academics and some economists seem to think that we've got it licked, that we just know how to do things, and we can just print as much money as we like, and there's no consequences. We pressed the button during the pandemic for £400 billion worth, and look where inflation went. It's sometimes we need to remember the basics, that if you have too much money circulating within an economy, things become more expensive. That's just how it is. So we do need to remember the basics. And the modern monetary theory, which was popular again, when conditions were good, or certainly not even good, stable, should we say? These fads come and go. The basics remain. Have too much money,
Mm-hmm.
inflation goes up.
Okay, so we are impatiently awaiting the government's budget that has been postponed pretty much as they can. My assumption is that they're doing it like because they just don't really know what to do. So if we've got this massive hole, like surely the taxes have to go up, right? I mean, the people, like for a lot of people out there, they will be thinking, well, if we've got such a massive debt problem, like we have to raise the taxes, and there is this, Gary economics crowd that is like, well, tax the rich, sorted. Can you just sort of give us an idea of like how much would we even need to tax people extra just to sort of stay afloat on what we are currently doing and the interests that we are currently
Yeah,
paying?
yeah. Well, public spending is around 44% of GDP, so you're looking at about sort of 1.3 trillion a year. Um, so if you increase income tax by 1 percentage point, the HMRC figures suggest that that would raise revenues by about 6 billion, right? So if you're talking about fiscal black holes of the tens of billions, that shows you the kind of thing that you need to do just to the basic rate of income tax to just repair the black hole, right? So tax the rich. Okay, how do you do that? The top 1% of income earners currently pay, well, up until recently, they paid about 30% of all income tax receipts. So the top 1% of income earners already pay quite a lot of income tax as a proportion of the total paid. That's actually gone down slightly, and there's a couple of reasons why that might be. One is that people on high incomes have chosen to relocate because of the fiscal situation in the UK, and that is also because of what I was trying to describe earlier about when you increase the personal allowance, you sort of squeeze into the middle of the distribution, the heavy lifting on paying income tax. But the point is that high earners already shoulder a reasonably high proportion of the burden when it comes to paying income tax. Now, what they'll probably be talking about is wealth taxes, of course. So tax wealth. Okay, how do you do that? It's a very difficult thing to do, and it sounds instinctively great, right? You've got all this wealth, we should have some, but wealth by definition is more mobile than income. If you've got a job, you kind of need to stay where the job is, but if you're wealthy, then you can go wherever you really want to, and there'd be more favorable conditions for you in Italy or Dubai, etc., etc. And we might not like that might sound distasteful, but that's the fact. And would we rather people were here paying taxes and using the private sector economy, buying things and going to the theatre and going to restaurants and helping create jobs and growth in that way? Or would we rather they went elsewhere? I know what I would pick. And also, wealth taxes, more countries are getting rid of wealth taxes than are adopting them for the very reasons I'm outlining. I think, in the early 1990s, there were over a dozen OECD countries with some form of wealth tax. That's now 4. You've got countries like Norway that have had big problems with their wealth tax. Spain have had big problems with a wealth tax. They've had court cases lodged by regional governments because there was lots of inward migration, by people that were looking to not pay it, essentially. So wealth taxes sound good until they're enacted. And then what you end up with, again, is quite a self-defeating cycle of a shrinking tax base. So you're relying on fewer and fewer taxpayers. And guess who you're relying on? You're relying on people who are on £40,000 a year, £50,000 a year, £60,000 a year, aspirational people who want to get on in their jobs, nurses, teachers, police officers, bricklayers. They're going to be the ones that are going to be footing the bill for all of this.
Mm-hmm.
With rich people not paying tax at all, which is a suboptimal situation. And then, parallels with the 1970s, of course. There were marginal rates of tax back then of 98%, sometimes over 100% in Britain. And it was very famous for famous people going elsewhere. Lots and lots of famous people decided to decamp from Britain back then. So it's got historical precedent. Doesn't really work, and I'm interested in what works as opposed to what doesn't work. So again, I'd go back to a tax system that is simple, one that doesn't discriminate against what you do or how you earn your money as long as it's legal. Um, you know, and it doesn't have a particular favorite type of industry or anything like that. Everybody pays the same, and if you earn twice, pay twice as much. You go back to those really simple principles. So actually, for me, that's the solution, much more than how do we just tap up people for more money within the existing framework.
I mean, that is that sounds wonderful, but that is ideologically incompatible with the current government. They are never going to come out and say we will abolish the wealth tax because, like,
Well,
their
yeah.
MPs are going to
You might
be
have, you
like
might have a point,
literally
but a direct wealth
fit.
tax. Yeah, and you're right. But a direct wealth tax has been discussed. Has been the current government
Yeah.
have put distance between themselves and a wealth tax, but they're looking at other ways of doing that, right? So pensions. Pension contributions have a generous tax allowance. Property, that they're looking at all these other asset classes and saying, right, how do we get more money from those? Again, that has quite perverse outcomes. And what we've been asking people to do over a series of decades is to be responsible and save, so that you're not such a burden on the state as you go through life. However you constitute that. And now we're telling them, actually, no, you've been responsible all your life, but we're going to come back and take some of that money. So I think that there's that kind of visceral outpouring of, hang on a minute, I've done the right thing. I've done exactly what you've asked me to do over several decades, which was to work hard, play by the rules, save for a rainy day. And now you want to take my savings as well. I think that there's a genuine outpouring on that regard. And then there's a popularity question as well, because this whole Gary's economics thing, obviously, getting loads and loads of views on YouTube, and it feels instinctively correct and intuitively correct, and almost like common sense. Why wouldn't you do this? But then if one thinks, okay, if inheritance tax itself is a form of a wealth tax in many ways. The Taxpayers Alliance did polling on this very recently, and it is by far and away the most unpopular tax, and that applies across all of the different cross breaks that you'll have in polling. So that's whether you're a Green Party member, Lib Dem, left wing, right wing, age, gender, whatever else. It is by far and away the most unpopular tax, and by a plurality, every single cross break wants to get rid of inheritance tax, not just cut it, get rid of it. One group, and that is those with PhDs. So our academic friends know better than us, of course. They know better than hardworking
Oh,
businesses and families from the countries that are trying to manage their own affairs. But
oh
across the
God.
board, it is by far and away the most unpopular tax. So the reason I'm making that point is that while wealth taxes seem inherently and intuitively, popular or whatever, when it's put to the test, what are you going to do with your money? People have a slightly different attitude towards that. So, and last point is that there's not that many rich people. There's not as many rich people as we're led to believe. So, you could turn up the dials on a wealth tax. It actually wouldn't even bring in all that much money, even if it worked as intended, which it wouldn't. So, it'd be an extremely small pool of people who are extremely mobile. So it falls down on almost every single facet, really. And then as ever with polling, if you put it to the test, do you want more money spent on the NHS? Yeah, of course I do. That feels nice. Do you want to pay for it? I shouldn't. Somebody else should, not me. So when it gets tested in the real world, it doesn't really work out.
You know what? I don't. I would prefer to pay or to have an option to pay something towards like almost like an insurance, like a bit of the mix of the insurance model, because the inefficiencies in the NHS are staggering. Like I'm fighting with NHS, and I have been fighting with them for the last 2 years, and I do have some business experience. I've got a couple of businesses with me and my fiance. If any business was run like certain departments of NHS, they just wouldn't stay afloat for any longer than 6 months.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a really important
The
point. Really.
processes are ridiculous. Like we are pouring money into boats that have got multiple holes in them.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um,
You're dead right, and it's a very important point because we're spending too much money. All this talk about tax and how do we fiddle here and fiddle there. We're not addressing the first question: is why do we spend so much money in the first place? And the current government are obviously not in a position to do anything about that right now because they tried to make small changes to welfare such that they weren't even going to decrease welfare spending. They were going to reduce the amount that it was increasing by, and they couldn't get that through, and they got a 170 seat majority. So, but we need to address that spending question, and welfare is an important part of that. Public sector pensions are an important part of that, but healthcare is a huge part of that as well. And we have this misguided impression in Britain that we are the only country in the world that has universal coverage of healthcare. It's simply not true. Everyone who says, "Oh, what about America?" America's a bad model for us. It has
mhm,
very high premiums for users of healthcare.
yeah.
It also has very high cost to government. They actually spend a bigger proportion of GDP than we do. So it's not a model that we ought to copy, but it's the one that the NHS fanatics throw at anybody that suggests any idea of reform. They say, "Oh, you want us to be like America?" Not at all. How about Germany? How about the Netherlands? The Netherlands, in particular, has a very good mix of insurance and taxpayer protection. And these countries all have universal coverage. We are not unique in providing universal coverage.
Mhm.
So, in the Netherlands, for instance, you can choose between competing insurance providers. So you get power as a patient, but if you have a pre-existing condition, they cannot just price discriminate against you. So you have that guarantee of, sort of blind coverage.
Yeah.
We're not unique in this regard. The debate is starting to shift, but it's going to need a hell of a lot more. I think people do genuinely believe that it's this unique institution, the only one in the world that provides
Mhm.
healthcare when you turn up at the door. It's simply not true. And you hear about all the junior doctors who are going on about their pain and conditions, and then they're the biggest advocates for the NHS, but then they say, "Oh, we're all going to go off to Australia." And it's like, okay, well, if you think the Australian system's so good and looks after its staff, how about we copy how it's funded? How about we have that sort of mixed model? Oh no, we
Yeah.
couldn't possibly have that. So there's a contradiction in their own argument. But you're absolutely right. Until we get a grip of that kind of big picture challenge, getting a grip of public spending will be incredibly difficult. And the NHS is unfortunately badly run, badly managed. There are cases where I'm wrong, and actually some trusts
Mhm.
do very well. And why not copy? Why not use best practice and benchmark? All this kind of stuff. But in the whole, we could. I'm really of the opinion you could sign a check to the NHS for 50 billion tomorrow, and it wouldn't make a blind bit of
It,
difference.
I completely agree. Like the gaps in the NHS are so big that you only realize it once you need NHS for something.
Yeah.
It is extraordinary.
Yeah,
Like,
and I think we have quite good, pretty good, in fact, very good acute care in Britain. If you have a heart attack or you break your leg and you turn up at
yes.
A&E, it's pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
It's not bad at all. But primary care, where you're seen by a doctor with, who needs to diagnose a condition or primary care at GP level is shocking, absolutely appalling. And that's not
Yeah.
to say GPs don't do a good job. Some do, some don't. But the health outcomes in this country are appalling. We've got late cancer detection rates versus other European nations. But there's a mix in there. We do some things well and some things absolutely hideously badly, but the funding model is completely busted, and until we fix it, the NHS doesn't get fixed.
I think the interesting thing about the NHS is it does have this sort of holy cow place in the hearts of people, and like I think the politicians really need to start driving the message that you have to be responsible for your own health to a certain degree. So like acute situations and all that, yes, but managing diabetes and things like that, there is so many chronic conditions that I think people really need to start being encouraged and sort of pre-prepared by the government that with some of these conditions, like you will have to deal with a lot of it, because we would all want to have a cutting edge treatment on NHS. It's impossible.
Yeah, yeah,
It's,
yeah, yeah. It's a really interesting one. So, is the country ready to have that kind of conversation? It may come a point where we've got no choice. But if the government were responsible, forward thinking, looking to lead on the issue, yeah, of course. And with this kind of thing now, that there's fairly good private sector firms doing diagnostics and things like that that can give you a fairly good map of where you're at health wise. And if people were encouraged to take that up, maybe with tax breaks, I don't know how it would work, but
mm-hmm.
um, people could be in control of their own situations a lot more easily. What we
Yeah.
seem to do in this country is mollycoddle people. It's like, we'll solve all of your problems for you.
Mm-hmm.
The pandemic made it much worse. They paid
Yeah.
people to sit at home. And off the back of that, now we've got situations where people who even mention the two words mental health, they're just given a big fat check, and that is unsustainable for the long term. But I think you're right. I think if we're in a situation where people are sort of more aware of their own health and things like that, we might sort of alleviate the burden on the more acute end of the NHS. Absolutely.
I think it would be kinder for people long term to be honest with them, because I think if the government doesn't make a decision for them, that decision is going to make itself for itself at some point, because they'll have no choice in the matter.
No,
But
no. Sorry, go on.
the one thing that I wanted to really gauge your opinion on is, imagine that you can plant an idea in Rachel Reeves's mind, sort of Inception style, of we've got two levers that we can pull realistically: control the spending and pull down the spending,
Hmm.
increase taxes. What would you do?
So I'm going to steal an idea. I think controlling spending is the most important thing, because I think that only then can you really start to think about the tax system in the whole and think about tax reform and things like that. So I think that at the moment we have fiscal rules that chancellors set themselves, but are kind of have their hands tied by. So at the moment, a lot of it's you know earmarked against getting debt down by the fifth year of the cycle and this kind of thing. So what that means is that you can sort of game the system. So you can do 4 years of the debt going up, and then if you get it slightly down on the fifth year, jobs are good, and even though it went up overall. So there's all these kind of, and then of course the OBR then judge you against those, which means that you get all these situations like Rachel Reeves has a £60 billion black hole, etc., etc. However, an economist called Ryan Bourne noted that actually what might be a better way is to look backwards instead of forwards. So what you do is that you look at the last, say, 4 or 5 years tax receipts and say, okay, realistically, what can the economy generate in terms of tax receipts? And then use that, uprate it by inflation maybe or whatever, and then use that to set a realistic spending cap for the next 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
And say, this is what we can actually raise. This is, plus some projections on, population, blah, blah, blah. But essentially, with a projection forward, this is what we can reasonably spend over the next 5 years. And then you work within that framework. And it's actually based on real data rather than dodgy forecasts. And addressing the spending question would then set the parameters for how much tax can be raised, and can we
Mm-hmm.
reform tax? And if we're actually keeping to our spending cap, maybe we can start to think about, okay, should we abolish inheritance tax? It only brings in 8 billion a year. Why not just get rid of it? It's causing complication, etc., etc. So I would steal his idea, drill that into the minds at the fine minds at the Treasury, and say we need to get spending under control. So go backwards and look at what the economy can feasibly generate, and then use that to forwardcast
Mm-hmm.
our spending.
And then in terms of the tax that you think would still respond the best in terms of the sort of lever pulling, because obviously they've tried to pull the lever on the public private schools. That tax lever backfired. They tried to pull number of sort of taxes, and they've already sort of taxed the wealthy. I mean, the people with any amount of money. It wasn't just millionaires. The people
Mm-hmm.
with any amount of money in business, they were preparing for a Labour government for a long time, and they moved their wealth 2-3 years ago already, as much as they could.
Which is why wealth taxes don't work.
So, what are the sort of tax levers that they realistically do have in the current climate that actually pulling on that lever would change something? Because right now, what I'm with my uneducated mind, what I'm seeing is they're pulling on these levers, but there's nothing coming out, nothing extra.
Yeah, I don't have a magic answer for you, and I think if I did, then the Treasury would be stealing it. I think that kind of inertia just shows that history shows us that we sort of max out at about 37% of GDP when it comes to tax receipts. Businesses change their incentives, they hire fewer people, all these dynamic knock-on effects happen, and as a country we don't really get past 37% of GDP in receipts. So I'm not sure there are levers to pull. The only one that is income tax, is national insurance, is VAT, is one of the big three that is broad based, and is close to guaranteed revenue. The rest won't touch the sides.
1%, 6 billion. I mean, that would only bring 60 billion if you raised it by 10%. If you raised it by that much, like, there
and
would
it
be
and it,
riots on the
and it
streets.
probably
I've got no
wouldn't.
doubt about it.
Yeah, and it probably wouldn't because of all the dynamic, effects and knock on. But this is what I mean. We're sort of maxed out. We're tapped out, and there is no sort of magic source of revenue that hasn't yet been taxed that doesn't have a disastrous economic effect. Like I said, with things like pensions, that's a classic one because there's so much money in pensions. The Treasury sort of lick their lips at, we having some of this. But you get very, very perverse incentives. You get people saving less. So then they come calling on the state later in life. The knock-on effects are quite profound. So I think that we're kind of tapped out. And you mentioned private school fees. The stuff that was just pure ideology. It was
Yeah.
vindictive. It was nasty. It was anti-aspiration. There are lots of people who use private education because the state schools in their area aren't good enough, and they work quite hard, 2 jobs sometimes, to make sure that they can pay kids to go to school. And what they've actually done is pulled the rug from out under aspirational working middle class people to use that system for their own children, and leave it at the preserve of quite often overseas children of foreigners to who the VAT thing doesn't touch the size for them. So what you've actually done is just made it an even more elite institution than it was before. So all they've done is just been nasty, vindictive. They earmarked the money for more teachers. That hasn't materialized.
I was
So
going to say that. Where are the teachers that
where are the
they've
teachers?
promised? Where
Where are
are
the
they?
and there's something profound in the culture about that, which is private education, or education in general, is something that this country is very, very good at. Why don't we celebrate that? Why do we always go, oh, we're good at that, we should punish it? There's a very sort of sick culture there where we punish the things that we're good at, rather than sort of say, actually, we're brilliant at this. Why don't we celebrate that? I don't think that was a tax lever that was pulled in order to generate revenue for public services at all. I just think it was a vindictive move aimed at pleasing their people and upsetting the others. I think that's all it was about, really. And I think any future government ought to reverse that immediately.
That was the most depressing thing you've said to me. That there are no more levers to pull. I thought that maybe there is still something that they haven't tried. There is
There, there,
still something clever that they can do, and
there
it's
are
just
there are
me being
levers to pull.
uneducated that can't see
No,
it.
no, no. There are levers to pull. They can do whatever they like, really. But they need to be cognizant of the fact that there are knock-on effects, and I think that they don't realise that there are second-order effects, third-order effects, unintended consequences, all of that kind of stuff. Um, Again, okay, let's get the corporations to pay. Put up corporation tax. Okay, lower wages, higher prices, lower returns to capital, so you get lower investment. These are the things that actually happen in the real economy. So they can do all sorts of things, Kat, but will they actually work is a different question.
Okay, for a normal, not for a normal person that is working hard, their standard conditions are going down. Other than following Taxpayers Alliance and actually learning a little bit more about how those levers work, what can people do to prepare for the next a year, which is looking like quite a bumpy one?
It's very difficult because if you ask them to, double down and save more, you read in the papers that they want to come after ISAs. You read in the papers that they want to come after pensions. So what on earth are people supposed to do is very, very difficult, really, really difficult. So short of just sort of waiting and see what happens at the budget, I wouldn't really have a huge amount of advice, because it seems like the current government is open to all ideas on how to come after more of our money, except the one idea, which is to reduce spending. Um, that's the only idea that actually has any sort of long-term sustainable, makes any sustainable sense, is to actually get a grip of public spending, get a grip of welfare, get a grip of healthcare spending, as we discussed. Adult social care is a massive problem.
Yeah.
Until we get a grip of those big picture costs, we're in big trouble. And I don't think that there are magic pots of money out there that you could raid without significant knock-on consequences.
Well, a bright note to finish on.
We're a happy bunch at the TPA.
And getting more happy by every month, I imagine.
Yeah,
Okay, so can you actually tell just a little bit more about Taxpayers
yeah,
Alliance and
of
what you
course.
do? Because I think you are actually one of the sort of resources for people that they can sort of lean on to perhaps get a objective picture of what's
Yeah,
going
yeah,
on.
yeah. The TPAs it was formed in 2004. It was formed at a time when New Labour were in charge. Public spending really started to go up, and the Conservative opposition at the time was incredibly weak. It was Tony Blair, it was Gordon Brown, New Labour all the way, and so there was no real opposition to this idea that spending was going to increase massively, and therefore taxes need to go up to finance that. So the TPA was formed back in 2004. We've obviously gone through various iterations, and we are where we are today. We're quite a hyper local group as well. We do lots of work in Westminster, and we talk about the stuff that you and I have just been talking about till we're blue in the face. But we do lots of work on the ground as well. So we do lots of work in high streets around the country, town squares, tackling very hyper local issues, whether that's local spending or council tax or business rates, that kind of thing. So we're
Mm-hmm.
reasonably unique in that we actually go out and do stuff and talk to people outside of SW1. So we've got that element. So if people who are watching this, who are interested in things that are happening at their local council, feel free to get in touch. No issue is too small for us. Politics is very local. People care they care about the stuff like the national debt, but it's very hard to comprehend figures like 3 trillion. What does that mean? But
Yeah.
if a council wastes 50 grand, that's 50 families council tax bill for the year. People can equate those
Mm-hmm.
things more readily. And at the end of the day, people want their bins collected, their street lights to work, and for their roads to not have potholes. It's quite straightforward. Um, so we're very hyper local as well as national. We've got an office in Westminster, but we do lots of stuff out and about in the country. So yeah, if taxpayersalliance.com is the website. We've got an email bulletin that goes out weekly that people can sign up for free. And then if they're interested in the work that we do, of course, we're based on donations, so we welcome any support. But yeah, it's an interesting time for us because 14 years of conservative rule. There was this impression that there was unending austerity, spending was being cut to the bone. The truth was slightly different. Actually, spending wasn't being cut by as much as people think,
Mm-hmm.
and all the while, the tax base was being shrunk. Certain taxes were going up, etc., etc. But now we're in a completely different situation where all bets are off. Farmers, family-owned businesses, people who want to save for their own future, people that want to send their kids to a particular school. You're now in the crosshairs of the state, and that's a very dangerous place, we think. So that's why we're sort of stepping up our campaigns over the next few years.
Mm-hmm. Why did people feel that there was such an austerity? Do you think is it just because our expectations of what the government can actually provide has gone up through the roof, and we
Yeah,
haven't actually
that is
noticed
part of
that
it.
even cutting it ever so slightly will hurt?
I think that is part of it. I think part of it was a narrative thing. It was a big thing in the media that I think that the Chancellor himself at the time encouraged because he wanted to be seen as somebody who was responsible with the public finances and this kind of
Yeah.
thing. But there was also a very real element to this, which is that the composition of the reductions in spending, such as they were very much passed out to local authorities. The local authorities did a lot of the heavy lifting when it came to correcting the public finances through that period. Whitehall was protected. Um, Public sector headcount again reasonably protected, bar some tweaks. But a lot of the pain was distributed outwards from Whitehall. So it was quite clever politically. It's horrible realistically, but clever politically to sort of say, you guys deal with the damage. We'll be fine here in Whitehall. Thanks very much. And some local authorities saw reductions in their budget over the period of about 40% odd. And it's left local authorities now in a position, interestingly, where sometimes more than 3/4 of their budget, sometimes more than 80% of their budget is spent on adult social care, and another big chunk is spent on special education needs. So
80%.
yeah, we're in a really, really bad spot with this kind of thing. So that kind of pain was devolved outwards. All the while, things were protected in Whitehall. And so there was a clever sort of political ruse, if one could see it that way. I don't, but I suppose some do. So I suppose that austerity was real for people who saw their council services diminishing. But the feast continued in SW1 for sure.
Wow. Okay. Well, John, thank you very much for your time. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you John O'Connell. Go and follow Taxpayers Alliance.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.